Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. All Israeli leaders, military and civilian, acknowledged that the operational and tactical considerations and constraints governing the Gaza war are subordinate to the strategic ones having to do with global powers and regional interests. What are these strategic factors, and are they enhancing Israel's ability to employ force or inhibiting it? With us to elaborate on this matter, we're joined from the United Kingdom by retired Colonel Joel Rayburn, who is the former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Levant and Special Envoy for Syria. Thank you for joining us, sir. Also joining us is Brigadier General in Reserve Yossi Kuperwasser, who is the former Director General of the Ministry for Strategic Affairs here in Israel and the IDF Intelligence Directorate Research and Assessment Commander, as well as currently he's the Director of Middle East Developments at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. Thank you for joining us, General.
Thank you for having me.
And with me here in the studio is currently sitting in for TV7 Editor-at-Large, Mr. Amir Oren, is Mr. Eran Etzion, who is former Deputy Director of the Israeli National Security Council and an in-house panelist here at TV7. Thank you for joining us.
Sure.
Could you provide us a broader understanding on the complexities from a strategic perspective to the various developments pertaining to the current crisis, obviously the war here in Israel, but it is much broader and much more intertwined than some may think?
Yeah, first of all, what is happening here from a strategic perspective is obviously a tremendous shock to everybody involved. For us in Israel, from the Prime Minister down, this was totally unexpected, even though there was a strategic alert, strategic warning, provided by our military intelligence, Mossad and others, pertaining to Iran and Hezbollah, mainly Iran, but Iran and its proxies, early identification of what they perceived as Israel's weakness because of the internal turmoil and so on, one factor. And the other was their intent on trying at least to foil Israeli-Saudi rapprochement. So these two factors were understood, I think, on time, but were not reacted upon. And now we find ourselves, and the Americans, the Europeans, the Chinese, the Russians, finding themselves under surprise conditions, trying to fashion a response. And America has adapted, I think, in the best possible way, in terms of readjusting its strategic posture. Russia, I think, is in a position of essentially, for now, sitting back and enjoying the scene. And they're the only actor, obviously, interested in the widening of the conflict, I think. We'll have to, maybe our guests will have their opinion on what is the Iranian interest here, what is Hezbollah's interest here, and so on. Israel's interest is also in question, and we understand that within the cabinet there is a debate on whether or not there is a strategic opportunity now for Israel to preempt Hezbollah. It's not exactly preemption now, but to initiate the opening of a second front. A proposal that was made to cabinet, according to various reports, and was rejected. But there was a debate on that. So Israel is finding itself in the possibly the worst possible opening conditions for its war with Hamas in Gaza, for a potential war with Hezbollah and possible deterioration to additional fronts in Syria and vis-a-vis Iran and so on, with unprecedented backing by the US, and with the possibility of the widening of the conflict, certainly beyond Gaza and into additional fronts in the Middle East, but also potentially on a global scale because of the Russian position here, their presence in Syria, and a big, huge question mark on China's position. So this is all developing very quickly. The stakes are as high as they can get. And most actors, I think, are trying to adapt and have not adapted yet.
I think it is also important to note, with a big question mark about China, that the defense ministry there has confirmed that indeed 5 vessels, war vessels, have been diverted into the Persian Gulf.
They're replacing
other vessels.
A normal presence. Yeah,
Okay.
It's not a special
with its
expedition.
naval port in Djibouti, of course, and other assets in the region. But I'd like to ask Colonel Rayburn, of course, before we dive into your assessment of things for me not to get in trouble with your staff, I would like also to highlight that you are the founding director of the American Center for Levant Studies. So I appreciate you taking out of your busy schedule to once again update us on the latest. With regard to the American perspective, where are things currently standing? Obviously, there is much at stake. This is not only an Israeli interest that we're talking about. There are American key strategic interests for the region. It's not oblivious to the Iranian scheme, but nonetheless, it is slow to react to the Iranian angle of things. What can you tell us about that?
Well, the U.S. administration still has 1 foot in deterrence and 1 foot in détente, or I should say, the U.S. administration has put 1 foot forward into deterrence and kept 1 foot in détente. It still, while the Pentagon and Secretary Austin and General Kurilla, the CENTCOM commander, have made very strong and prudent military posture changes to try to increase the deterrent against the Iranian regime and its proxies from escalating the conflict. You haven't seen the kind of non-military measures that the administration would need to take to signal that it's fully embracing a strategy of deterrence now against the Iranian regime and is putting aside what was, essentially an appeasement policy dating back to even before the JCPOA, I would say dating back to 2009. Toward the Iranian regime. And so it's a mixed strategic message. So still the U.S. is not getting the maximum benefit from the military moves because it's the non-military measures. For example, still there's been no announcement that there's going to be a change of policy on enforcing sanctions on Iranian regime oil sales. There's no cracking down on funds from the Iraqi government or freezing of dollars that the Iraqi government would pay to the Iranian regime and so on. And until things like that are done, and until there's an explicit acknowledgement by the U.S. administration of the Iranian prime mover role in this broader conflict, then the military deterrence will be of limited effectiveness, and unfortunately, that's going to introduce risk. The less effective, the less credible that military deterrent messaging and moves are, then the more likely there's going to be a broader war. So it's an unsafe position for the U.S. administration to be in.
Indeed. Well, General Kuperwasser, I'd like to hear your perspective on things, particularly also with regard to the United States, which obviously is closely coordinating and cooperating with the State of Israel. We, of course, referred to a couple of days ago to the cruise missiles being fired from Yemen towards Israel, which were intercepted by an American vessel, which also was then subject to repeated suicide drone attacks, which it also managed to intercept. It seems like there is a lot at stake here from a strategic perspective. How do you view things?
Well, it is a very complicated situation, but we have to go back and see how did we get to this point. And what happened in the last couple of years was that the Western camp facing Iran and its proxies was becoming weaker and weaker. And the fact of the matter was that while Iran was moving towards having the capability to produce nuclear weapons and entering the threshold state, the international community led by the United States did nothing. And later on, when the Iranians started providing UAVs to the Russians for their war in Ukraine, nothing was actually done. And the sanctions relating to the ballistic missiles were taken off, and nothing was done. And the Iranians were strengthening their position in the region, and nothing was done to the extent that Saudi Arabia decided to resume diplomatic relations with Iran, with Chinese sponsorship, and Assad was welcomed again to the Arab fold. This was the situation in this confrontation between Iran and the United States. The feeling was that the Americans are really weak and are not ready to face Iran's ambitions. And the same was the case with another member of the Western camp, which was Israel. It was also very sending signs of weakness. Iran referred to the problems inside Israel in the last year, yes, this was one thing. But even beforehand, with the strange Israeli decision to allow Hezbollah force it into a deal with Lebanon on the gas, in which Israel gave up everything that it stood for the last 10 years in this respect. This was a clear sign of weakness, and that was followed by weakness in answering the provocations of Hezbollah along the year, with the attack in Megiddo and so on and so forth, the 10th. And when the camp of the Western camp was trying to make the first steps in order to change this situation, with from promoting the idea of normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, it was the time for Hamas to try and do something in order to prevent that and take advantage of the weakness. What happened now was that they had some miscalculations. They believed that the Israeli answer, coming out of this weakness of the camp and of Israel itself, will be limited to another round of atrocities in which Israel is going to bombard Hamas positions until at one point the Hamas will be ready to give up launching rockets, and there's going to be a nice exchange of prisoners that would allow Hamas to have all of its prisoners out of jail, and the equation regarding the siege over Gaza is going to change. This was the Hamas anticipation. They misread the picture, and what happened was that immediately there was a show of unity. I'm not sure if it is a real unity, but at least a show of unity on behalf of Israel. And much more than that, there was the feeling that the penny is falling for the United States, understanding that they have a commitment as leaders of the international order and the leaders of the West to do something in order to make sure that this trend of weakness is going to change. And this is why they decided not only to show solidarity with Israel as everybody else does, facing this horrific terror attack, but also to take some critical military moves that put them, as was said here, on the deterrence leg, and maybe even more than that, and clarifying that they are going to stand next to Israel. They cannot afford Israel losing this battle. It's too risky. And so they say clearly, yes, we expect Israel to fight by the book, but we want Israel to win. And so say the Germans, the British, the Italians, and the French. So it's a new situation that, in my mind, Hamas and Iran didn't envisage as something that's going to happen. And we are in the midst of this confrontation. The Iranians have a lot of things to evaluate and think of what are the repercussions that may come if they move forward and escalate further. They have decided to escalate a little bit, just to test the water, with the Houthis, as you mentioned, and with the attacks on American bases in Iraq and Syria. But they have not crossed the line that would indicate that they have decided to go for an all-out war, and because they understand it's maybe, first of all, it's too early, and secondly, it's quite risky. They might decide to do that because they are fanatics, but they have a different way of thinking than ours, but they haven't decided to do it yet. And what stands now on the line is the possibility that the axis led by Iran is going to lose one of its most precious assets, the control of Gaza, that allows it to carry out such attacks as we saw on October 7th.
Indeed. Even though I'm a big supporter of the rules-based, the importance of the law and the laws of war, I think if you really think about the big picture, going back to Otto von Bismarck, who said that the moment war starts, you can throw every treaty into the garbage bin, and then 2 world wars ensued. So obviously there are reasons for those rules to happen, and therefore when we're looking at the scheme of things at this stage, to what degree are those strategic complexities which we heard, which I'd like also to hear your perspective too, are they challenging the Western mentality or civilization, which obviously is under threat, but to what degree on the strategic level is it being counterbalanced to a certain degree?
I'm not sure I buy into this scheme of clash of civilization and our conflict here in Gaza kind of intertwined in a potential World War III. I do think that there is a real test here for Israel, for its place in the region, for its policy, for its relations with its enemies, first and foremost Iran, but not only. It's also a test for the American posture, and we'll see what this administration does, and we'll see what happens if there is a change of administration a year from now, which I think will have a tremendous impact on everything that we're discussing here. But I think it would be very interesting to think about the realistic outcomes, end states, of this conflict and their potential implications. And I want to posit at least my initial modest idea of what is possible and what is not. I think, for example, that a regime change in Iran is not in the cards. I think
Within what context?
within the context of a widening conflict, an actual conflict between Israel and Iran, potentially even between the US and Iran, I don't think there's going to be a regime change in Iran.
Even if the United States
Yes.
enters into the conflict, you
Yes.
don't see? Interesting.
No.
Okay.
No. Neither do I see a complete, shall we say, restructuring of Lebanon. I simply don't see it. Perhaps I would like to see it, but realistically, I don't see it. Even if there is full-fledged confrontation between Israel and Hezbollah with American involvement, I don't see an end state in which Lebanon is transformed into something totally different from what it is now. I don't see anybody capable of uprooting Hezbollah from Lebanon in the fullest sense. And when we zero in on Gaza, I would also question what is a realistic end state in Gaza. And I would say bluntly that absent a full, prolonged Israeli occupation of the entire Gaza Strip, there will not be an uprooting of Hamas in the military sense. And it's questionable even under these circumstances if there will be a total uprooting of Hamas, annihilation of Hamas, as some Israeli leaders are saying, in the wider sense, in the civilian sense, in the ideological sense, and so on. So I think it's very important for us, the strategists, to look at what are the realistic outcomes and think accordingly about the optimal policies in this kind of situation.
Indeed. Well, I'd like to hear both of our distinguished guests on this matter. Colonel Rayburn, we'll start with you. Do you see a reality change throughout the region concerning the fact, and if I interpret this correctly, Mr. Etzion, Hamas is more than just a terror organization, it's an ideology. And as Operation Inherent Resolve is currently with an open-ended deployment in Syria and Iraq to try and mitigate the resurface of the Islamic State, which remains very strong ideologically and religiously in those people, it seems like this challenge goes far beyond just those two countries.
I've been my entire adult life I've been dealing with the post 9/11 Middle East, and I long ago came to believe that ideology doesn't drive the region, and I think that actually the operative thing right now is Iranian power. I think that whether it's the Gaza problem or the Hezbollah and Lebanon problem, or the problem in Syria, or the problem in Iraq, these are driven not by ideology, but by Iranian power, by the the intrusion of the Iranian regime with military deployments, with hard power, soft power, etc., into those countries in an unprecedented way. And I think each one of those conflicts, including the Yemen conflict, would be greatly reduced in scope and actually solvable if the Iranians could be gotten out of them, if the link between the Iranian regime and these local conflicts across the region could be broken, could be severed. So that's one of the reasons why I've thought that the entire Middle East, one of the keys actually to the long-term stability of the Middle East is to try to get the Quds Force out of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, Gaza, but also to put pressure on the conduits that the Iranian regime uses to project its power across the region. And there's a guy who has not been named since October 7th very much, who's kind of hiding, running for cover as everything is going on around him. That's Bashar al-Assad. Bashar al-Assad is the vital link, the crucial link between Tehran and Hezbollah. He is the host for the two fronts that pose the greatest existential threat against Israeli security and others, Israel's neighbors and the Syrian neighbors as well. So I've thought for a long time that the U.S., Israel, and everyone else should be combining in a pressure coalition against the Assad regime to compel that regime to sever its relations with the Quds Force, and if it won't do that, then to put pressure on that regime to collapse it and let a successor state or a successor regime come into power in Damascus that will not be a conduit for the projection of destabilizing Iranian power in the Levant. So that's one of the things, if I were a strategist inside the U.S. government, inside an international coalition, that's what I would be suggesting we take a hard look at right now.
General Kuperwasser, your take on things?
Well, first of all, I agree that it's going to be extremely difficult to change the situation as long as we don't have a different regime in Iran. That's true, and this is the main problem in the Middle East. The way that the Iranians want to shape the region, and they are committed to do so. They are sending weapons all over the place. They're sending their financial assistance to everybody, buying the proxies and building their capabilities, and that's the bitter fruit of that effort that we are now having to eat. It's and we have to spit it. That's what we have to do with this bitter fruit. Now, at the same time, it's true that it's going to be very difficult to change the situation, both in Iran and in Lebanon, as Eran said. I fully agree with him. I also agree that there's nothing short of full control of Israel of the Gaza Strip in order to make sure that Hamas cannot operate from Gaza, because and that ideology does play a role, because the Palestinians are caught in this narrative of struggle against Zionism until its demise. And whether they support Hamas or they support Fatah, it doesn't really matter, because both are committed to this struggle. And we have to control the Gaza Strip in order to make sure that no terror attacks or no terror attacks of the kind that were carried out on October 7th may emerge from this territory. And this may take some time, to take over the Strip, and much more effort is going to be exerted in keeping control of the Strip. And then we shall have to see what can be done about Iran. It's a stage by stage. As long as we have the American commitment and understanding and growing understanding that this is a project of our generation, for the Americans. It's just like fighting ISIS, just like fighting the Nazis in the time of the Second World War. This is what the West has to do now. It has to make sure that something changes in Iran. And once this understanding is accepted by the Washington administration, then there's going to be potential for a change. But before that, we shall have to keep fighting.
Indeed. Well, I think one should also highlight, if I may paraphrase Clausewitz, who said that war is the extension of politics, so is diplomacy, and so are other tools within that scheme. Mr. Etzion, we're drawing near to the end of the program. In 2 sentences, where are things heading from here from a strategic perspective?
Well, Israel and the U.S. are consulting more closely than ever before about the actual possibilities in Gaza, in the north, in the wider region. This idea that was put forth here by Mr. Rayburn of and putting the, shall we say, the Syria box into this very complex strategic game is an interesting one that I agree should be considered. But of course, it's also not a magic stick that's in any way, shape, or form. We are going to have to reshape the situation in Gaza and in the wider Israeli-Palestinian context, hopefully with the assistance of the Americans beyond this administration, because it's going to take more than 1 year. And hopefully also with the assistance of a major regional actor, which we did not mention, which is Saudi. And if the outcome of this, on the positive side, is going to be a new regional and international coalition that will reshape the Israeli-Palestinian scene and the wider regional scene in a favorable way from an American, Israeli, Saudi perspective, then this may not have been in total vain.
Indeed. I actually think, and this is very important to highlight, that India is also a very important factor that not many have mentioned in recent weeks at least, but nonetheless, with focus on the last G20 summit at least, talking about the interconnector from India through the Middle East to Europe, establishing an alternative to the Chinese paradigm of a Roads and Belt initiative in which it is capable of taking over much of the infrastructure throughout this region, may be outmaneuvered, but of course everything needs to be weighed and considered very diligently. Unfortunately, we ran out of time, so this is all the time that we have for today, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Colonel Rayburn, General Kuperwasser, and Mr. Etzion for being part of today's panel as well. And I'd like to thank all of you at home as well. Until our next updates from here in Jerusalem. Shalom.
My name is Doron Gavish, and my background, 30 years of serving in the Israeli Air Force. My last job, I was the commander of the Israeli air and missile defense during the introduction of the Iron Dome to the defense of Israel. All of this allows me really to be part of the team here in TV7. It is super important to have such a platform. We talk about the global situation, we talk about Israel and those different angles which are relevant to the discussion.
For more of TV7's productions and editorials, we invite you to visit our website at tv7israelnews.com.